The federal government has collected over $214 billion in tariff revenue this year, and President Trump announced plans to return that money directly to the American people through $2,000 dividend payments. If you're a retiree relying on Social Security, you need to understand exactly what this proposal means for you, because the reality is more complicated than the headlines suggest. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent indicated the stimulus would apply to Americans earning less than $100,000 annually, and there's been no indication that seniors on Social Security wouldn't receive the payment. However, here's what economists are saying that you won't hear elsewhere. The estimated cost would be roughly $300 billion if everyone earning under $100,000 qualified, which exceeds the tariff revenue collected so far. Even more concerning for retirees, Treasury Secretary Bessent suggested the dividend might not be an actual check at all, but could instead refer to tax savings like no tax on Social Security benefits, tips, and overtime. The Supreme Court is currently reviewing whether Trump even has the legal authority to impose these tariffs, and if the court rules against the administration, they may have to return money to businesses, leaving nothing for dividend payments. This isn't about getting your hopes up or tearing them down. It's about understanding the complete picture so you can plan accordingly. Whether you'll actually see $2,000 in your bank account, receive it through tax savings, or see nothing at all depends on three critical factors that we're breaking down in detail today. So let's talk about what's really happening here, because there's a lot more to this story than what you're seeing in the headlines. The first thing you need to understand is where this money is actually coming from. When you hear politicians talk about tariff revenue, they make it sound like foreign countries are paying us this money, but that's not quite how it works in reality. American businesses that import goods are the ones writing the checks to the government, and then many of those businesses turn around and pass those costs on to you through higher prices. So in a very real sense, you've already been paying for this so-called dividend through more expensive groceries, clothing, electronics, and just about everything else that comes from overseas. Now here's where it gets interesting. President Trump has been saying that the government collected over $195 billion in tariff revenue in fiscal year 2025, which ended in September. That's a massive increase compared to previous years, and it's all because of the aggressive tariff policies his administration put in place. He's arguing that since the government took in all this extra money, it should be returned to the American people who essentially paid it in the first place. On the surface, that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? You paid more for goods because of tariffs, so you should get some money back. But when you start looking at the details, things get complicated really fast. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested that families making less than $100,000 a year would qualify for these payments. Now, if you're a senior living on Social Security, you might be wondering whether that includes you. The good news is that there's been absolutely no indication that Social Security recipients would be excluded from receiving these payments. In fact, if they use the same income thresholds they used for the pandemic stimulus checks, many seniors would definitely qualify because those payments went to individuals making up to $75,000 and married couples making up to $150,000. So if your income falls below those levels, you'd probably be eligible based on what we know so far. But here's the first major problem with this whole plan. Economists at the Tax Foundation did the math, and they figured out that if you're giving $2,000 to every adult American who makes less than $100,000 a year, you're looking at about 150 million people. That means the government would need roughly $300 billion just for that one payment. Remember that number I mentioned earlier about how much tariff revenue was collected? It was $195 billion for the entire fiscal year. Even if you factor in the higher collections expected in 2026, which economists estimate will be around $216 billion, you're still coming up short by tens of billions of dollars. And that's before we even talk about whether children would also receive payments, which would push the cost even higher, possibly up to $600 billion if it's structured like the pandemic payments were. Now you might be thinking, okay, so maybe they do one payment now and another one later when more tariff money comes in. But there's an even bigger issue lurking in the background that could make this entire plan impossible. The Supreme Court is currently reviewing whether President Trump even has the legal authority to impose most of these tariffs in the first place. During oral arguments that took place in early November, the justices sounded pretty skeptical about the whole thing. They kept pressing the administration's lawyers to show them where in the law it specifically says the president can impose tariffs as a way to deal with trade deficits or the fentanyl crisis. The law in question is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and it gives the president broad authority to regulate imports during national emergencies. The problem is, the law doesn't actually mention the word tariff anywhere in it. It says the president can regulate the importation of goods, but multiple Supreme Court justices pointed out that tariffs aren't really regulations, they're taxes. And under the Constitution, only Congress has the power to tax Americans. Several justices made it crystal clear during those oral arguments that they were troubled by the idea of a president having unlimited unlimited power to impose what amounts to a massive tax increase without Congress approving it. If the Supreme Court rules that these tariffs are illegal, and legal experts think there's a real possibility they will, then the government would have to return the money to the businesses that paid it. We're talking about roughly $100 billion that was collected under these emergency powers. If that money has to be refunded to businesses, it's not going to be available to send out as dividend checks to you. Treasury Secretary Bessent actually admitted this could become a nightmare scenario, saying it could cost somewhere between $750 billion to $1 trillion to unwind everything if the court rules against the administration. So you can see why they're nervous about this. But wait, because there's another twist to this story that makes things even more confusing. After President Trump made his initial announcement about the $2,000 payments, Treasury Secretary Bessent went on television and basically threw cold water all over the idea. He said the dividend might not actually be a check at all. Instead, he suggested it could refer to tax savings that people are already getting or will get through other provisions in Trump's tax bill. He specifically mentioned things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits, and deductibility of auto loan interest. Now let's talk about that Social Security tax issue for a minute, because this is something that directly affects you as a senior, and there's been a ton of confusion about it. During the 2024 campaign, Trump promised to eliminate federal income taxes on Social Security benefits entirely. That was a pretty bold promise that got a lot of seniors excited. But when his big tax bill, officially called the One Big Beautiful Bill, was signed into law in July, it didn't actually eliminate taxes on Social Security benefits. What it did instead was create a temporary $6,000 additional tax deduction for people aged 65 and older. This deduction is available from 2025 through 2028, and it phases out for singles making over $75,000 and couples making over $150,000. The White House and the Social Security Administration put out statements saying that this change means 88% of seniors receiving Social Security will no longer pay federal income taxes on their benefits. And that's technically true for many seniors, but it's not because Social Security income became tax exempt. It's because the larger deduction means your total taxable income drops below the threshold where you'd owe any taxes at all. If you're a single senior receiving the average Social Security benefit of about $24,000 a year, or a married couple where both receive that average benefit for a combined $48,000, then yes, the new deduction likely means you won't owe federal income taxes. But if your income is higher than that, or if you have significant income from other sources like pensions or investments, you could still end up paying taxes on your Social Security benefits. So when Secretary Bessent suggested that the $2,000 dividend could just be the value of tax savings like these, he was basically redefining what a dividend means. A dividend typically implies money showing up in your bank account or a check in your mailbox. Tax savings are valuable, absolutely, but they work completely differently. If you already weren't paying taxes on your Social Security because your income was low enough, then these tax changes don't give you any benefit at all. You can't save money on taxes you weren't paying in the first place. This brings us to another crucial point about timing. President Trump said more recently that these dividend payments would probably be issued in the middle of next year, which would be around mid-2026. But remember, the Supreme Court decision could come down any day now. Most legal experts expect a ruling by next summer at the latest. If the court invalidates the tariffs, or even a significant portion of them, before those dividend payments go out, then the whole plan could collapse entirely. The administration would be scrambling to refund businesses, and there wouldn't be any money left for individual payments. There's also the question of whether Congress would even approve this plan. Past stimulus checks required congressional approval. The 3 rounds of pandemic stimulus that went out in 2020 and 2021 were all passed by Congress and signed into law. The first round gave people $1,200, the second round gave $600, and the third round gave $1,400, with additional amounts for children. The total cost of those 3 rounds was over $814 billion, and that was during an economic crisis when the government was trying to prevent a complete economic collapse. Right now, the economy isn't in crisis mode. Unemployment is low, the stock market has been hitting record highs, and inflation has come down significantly from where it was a couple years ago. So Congress might not be so eager to approve spending another $300 billion or more on stimulus payments when there's no emergency justifying it. And speaking of inflation, that's another concern economists have raised about this whole dividend idea. When the government sent out those pandemic stimulus checks, most people either spent that money or used it to pay down debt. That surge in consumer spending contributed to the inflation we saw in 2022 and 2023. Economists estimate those stimulus payments added somewhere between 1 and 3 percentage points to the inflation rate. If the government sends out another round of checks now, it could potentially reignite inflation just when it's finally coming under control. That's especially risky when you consider that tariffs themselves are already pushing prices higher on imported goods. So you'd essentially be giving people money to offset the higher prices caused by tariffs. But then that money itself could cause even more inflation, which would cancel out the benefit. Here's something else to consider that doesn't get talked about enough. The revenue that comes from taxing Social Security benefits doesn't just disappear into the general fund. That money goes directly back into shoring up the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. Both of these programs are facing serious long-term funding shortfalls. Without any changes, Social Security is projected to run out of money to pay full benefits around 2035. If you cut off one of the revenue sources that helps fund these programs, you're essentially making that crisis worse and speeding up the timeline when benefits might have to be cut. Some estimates suggest that eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits would push the insolvency date up by a year or more. So when you put all of this together, you start to see why there's so much skepticism about whether these $2,000 dividend checks will actually materialize. The money might not be there, the Supreme Court could invalidate the source of that money, Congress might not approve spending it this way, and even if it did go through, the economic effects could be counterproductive. That's not to say it's impossible. Politics has a way of making things happen when there's enough pressure and will to do it. But right now, the obstacles are pretty substantial. What does this mean for you, practically speaking? First, don't count on that money being in your bank account anytime soon. Don't make any financial decisions based on receiving a $2,000 payment that might never come. Second, focus on the tax benefits that are actually already in place. If you're 65 or older, make sure you're taking advantage of that $6,000 additional deduction when you file your taxes. Work with a tax preparer or use tax software to ensure you're claiming everything you're entitled to. Third, keep an eye on news about the Supreme Court decision, because that's really the make or break moment for this entire plan. If the court upholds the tariffs, then the dividend payments become more realistic, though still not guaranteed. If the court strikes them down, you can pretty much forget about those checks. The bigger picture here is that this whole situation shows how complicated economic policy can get when you try to solve one problem but end up creating several others. Tariffs were supposed to protect American manufacturing and bring jobs back. Instead, they've raised prices for consumers, created uncertainty for businesses, and generated legal battles that could drag on for years. Now there's a proposal to soften the blow of those higher prices by sending people money, but that money comes from the higher prices in the first place. And sending it out could cause inflation that makes prices go up even more. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. For seniors especially, the focus should probably be on the practical benefits you can access right now, rather than promises about future payments that may never arrive. That enhanced $6,000 deduction is real, and it's available when you file your 2025 taxes. If you're not sure whether you qualify or how much it will save you, that's definitely worth looking into with a qualified tax professional. And if your income is low enough that you don't pay federal income taxes anyway, then honestly, a lot of these proposals won't affect you much one way or the other. You're already in a position where you're not sending money to the government, so tax cuts and deductions don't really help you, and a stimulus payment would be the only thing that actually puts money in your pocket. The bottom line is this. The $2,000 tariff dividend is an idea that's floating around, it's generated a lot of headlines, and President Trump has certainly talked about it enough that people are taking it seriously. But between the math not adding up, the Supreme Court potentially invalidating the funding source, Congress needing to approve the spending, and the economic risks of pumping more money into the economy, there are a whole lot of hurdles between here and actually receiving that money. So stay informed. Don't get your hopes up too high, and focus on making the most of the benefits and programs that are already available to you right now. That's the smartest way to navigate all of this uncertainty.